everybody. This is Truth Seeker here, and this is going to be kind of a patchwork video. There must be 20 vultures above my head. I hope that's not an omen. I had done a little number crunching on some stuff about the early history of Watchtower, and I've always been interested in that period of when the transition was made from Russell's Bible student movement to Rutherford's Jehovah's Witnesses. Jehovah's Witnesses, they make the claim today that they were the Bible students movement, just an extension, natural extension, evolution of the sect. And as time went along, the light became clearer and brighter, and it became clear by 1931 that they were to identify themselves as Jehovah's Witnesses. Those that associated with Watchtower and its work were now revealed to be Jehovah's Witnesses. And I grew up, as you all know from past videos, I grew up in the Bible students movement. And there was a split that took place, several splits that took place after Russell passed away. And these led to various organizations. And I've noticed that in the jw.org, they acknowledge that there were these splits. And I'm sure that they don't want to name them, but they're identifying Pastoral Bible Institute, P.S.L. Johnson's Layman's Home Missionary Movement. In the early 20s, there was a movement in the Pacific Northwest called the Stand Fast Movement. And then, by the early 1930s, the Dawn Bible Students Association arose. And that is the branch of Bible students I was born into and raised in. And these individuals that I knew were a part of the early Bible students movement. There was recently my cousin and I have been dialoguing, and he sent me a brochure that was printed called the Bible Students Monthly, and it was a publication that started in the early 1970s as a result of a split that took place within the Dawn Bible Students movement over really what amounted to a very minor doctrinal difference, but it caused splits throughout the Bible student world, very bitter splits, and probably a quarter of the Bible students, if not more, broke their association from the Dawn and began meeting separately and holding conventions on their own. They called it I.O., the I.O. convention. We had I.U. Because the General Convention, the Bible Students General Convention, which was sponsored by the Dawn, was held at Indiana University for so many years consecutively that it just became referred to as IU. So our counterparts had IO, They met in the Midwest. And it was a smaller convention, but they were the more conservative of the Bible students. Even though I have to admit that the Dawn Bible students were pretty conservative in their own right. These differences have more recently been mended within the movement because of necessity. Last July, they held a virtual general convention for the very first time because of COVID. The 2019 general convention was canceled because of COVID, and they didn't want to, or 2020 convention was canceled because of COVID, and they didn't want to see the same thing happen in 2021, so they held it online. Well, I listened into a couple of the discourses that were given, and I noticed the attendance was 350 or so, oscillating. People joined in, and usually the greatest attendance is Sunday, and I was surprised to see that it was less than 400 in attendance. When I was a kid at Indiana University back in the mid-1960s, attendance at the General Convention was over 1,000. But most of these that I knew, old-timers, many of them, were associates of Charles Taze Russell. There is a book that was published by William Schnell, 30 Years a Watchtower Slave, where he cites, where it's cited in this book that some 75% of the movement, of the original movement, left by the late 1920s. And I've always been interested in transitions, like the Dark Ages into the Middle Ages and so on, mysteries. And there is always this mystery to me as to what happened. What was going on? Because obviously P.S.L. Johnson's movement wasn't all that large. I mean, there are still associates of that group today in existence that descended directly from P.S.L. Johnson. They publish a website. I forget what it is right offhand, but they're very devout Russellites, and they don't believe. Johnson taught that he was the last of the 144,000, and that all that came into the movement after that were modern worthies or something like that. I forget what they called them, but they were to have some kind of an association with the ancient worthies, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David, all of those that were identified in the 11th chapter of Hebrews as faithful ones. Russell had taught that they would be the first to be resurrected in the kingdom, and they would take control of the government and be his earthly representatives. And P.S.L. Johnson just added the caveat that those that were coming into the Layman's Home Missionary, even though they didn't have the opportunity to be part of the heavenly class, they would be associates with the rulers, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, and all those guys. So that was the incentive to stay with Johnson. The PBI also formed early. Both the Layman's Home Missionary and the PBI, the Pastoral Bible Institute, formed about the same time, 1918, 1919, very shortly after Russell died. Their beef was with the new leadership of the Watchtower Society. And so they broke off. And at that time, I saw a figure somewhere given that maybe 1 in 7 had removed themselves from associating with Watchtower. Actually, my mother's branch of the family, once Russell died, they stopped meeting with the Bible students. They didn't like Rutherford, for one thing, but they believed the work was done. Russell focused on the 144,000. He called this the gospel age, the harvest period of the gospel age, and that it was the last work that was being done by God. And Jesus, during Jesus' presence, which came in 1874, and he used Bible chronology to arrive that date, Bible chronology that he really got from Nelson Barber. And by 1914, everything was to wrap up, and the expectation was that the work of calling the elect home to the church, 144,000, would be done. So there were those that expected that work would stop. The majority of individuals, though, stayed associated with the Watchtower, and that's evident. And if you've never visited J.W. Fact's website, the historical documents, if you're interested in any of the history, that's a great site to go to, because he has a lot of the original resources, a lot of the original watchtowers through I think ending in the 1940s. He has yearbooks that end around the same time, and there are a number of resources that he makes available online, and it gives you an idea if you want to do any research into the movement's early history. It gives you an opportunity. There are also other resources. There's Macmillan's book, Faith on the March. I've been aware of that book for quite some time. I've actually thumbed through it, although it's tedious to read. His writing style was awful. He wrote as if he was some, I don't know what he thought he was. He was very used a lot of verbiage, flowery language, and it's hard to follow. And one thing, though, that caught my interest is that one of his sections, he actually divided the book into 3 parts, and it's really based more from a personal perspective, but he names one of his sections Birth of a Nation. And if anybody is familiar with Birth of a Nation, it's that Griffith movie from I forget, it was in the early 19th, almost around the time of the photodrama of creation. It was really racist. It was an awful movie. It had Nathan Bedford Forrest and the Ku Klux Klan, and it was an awful book or movie. And he names a chapter of his book. Macmillan names a chapter of his book after that. Of course, he's identifying the new nation as being the Jehovah's Witnesses, but it gives you a little insight into the mind of the guy. And I guess back in the 50s, that was more politically tolerant, politically acceptable. And so he didn't think twice about using it. But anyway, I went to the Watchtower headquarters several years back, 2015, with Lloyd Evans and his wife, a very very nice gal. We had some nice chats, and his only daughter at the time, she and they had one baby at that time. I think she's 7 now. But we spent an afternoon there going through the historical section. They have a little museum that has books and the history from Watchtower's perspective. They have a collection of the Watchtower photodrama slides. They have some articles of clothing. I think it's Russell's cape and cane, top hat. There are other relics there. There was a chart of the ages, kind of an unusual one that I wasn't used to seeing, that printed or illustrated the jubilees on the bottom. I believe that particular chart of the ages, it was a big cloth tapestry that fit on the wall. I would say it was probably close to 4 feet by 10 feet in dimension. It was big, blue field, white imagery, and it showed these arches as as a dispensation of time and specific work of God. Very dispensationalist. Russell patchworked his doctrines from Adventist sources, and each one brought a little piece of the pie to the mixture. And all Russell did was just kind of put them all together, and that's what distinguishes the Bible student / Jehovah's Witness background from the Adventist background. It derives from it, but it's sort of a compilation of a variety of individuals' contributions. And so I listened to a talk. Okay, I guess I might as well just give a sort of the motivation behind this particular video. I listened to one of the General Convention talks given by an elder. He's been a fairly prominent, well-known elder. He's a little older than me. For the last between 40 and 45 years. He was born and raised in the Jehovah's Witnesses and ran afoul, I guess, to some extent with his elders, his Kingdom Hall. I think it had to do with education. He wanted to go to Rutgers and major in physics. I remember him telling me that because I was a physics major in college, and they discouraged him from doing it. So he didn't go at the time. He ended up getting a degree in engineering, I think electrical engineering at night, in a Pennsylvania, one of the Pennsylvania colleges, the Allentown area, Phillipsburg area. So, I mean, he's a smart guy, but yeah, it makes it tougher when you're discouraged from going to college and you're a little older. You got family and responsibilities, and you have to earn a living. It makes it a little tougher to go to college that way, but he did it. And I noticed in his talk how much he used Jehovah, the term Jehovah, so much more so than other Bible student speakers. Now, Bible students have always used the term Jehovah, but they were never as fanatical about it, using it. And he never referred to God. He always referred to Jehovah or Jehovah God. And it got me remembering our visit, Lloyd's family and me, our visit to the Watchtower. And they have one exhibit there of Bibles and facsimile Dead Sea Scrolls. Not particularly interesting. You see these old decaying Bibles on display, and you don't even really know. I mean, the Dead Sea Scrolls were just facsimiles, so you don't know if you're really looking at the real thing or not. So it wasn't all that interesting, but you had to stand on this line and wait. There was a queuing, and they before you enter the exhibit, you enter through a gate. And this video is going to be kind of a patchwork of things, and I don't know. I don't know how to go about it. All right, so please bear with me. It could be tedious, I don't know, but I'm thinking that some of this stuff is somewhat interesting. But anyway, there's this gate at the entrance of the exhibit, and this is a photo of a piece of that gate. This thing surrounds you, over you, around. It's like a little tunnel that you have to pass through, and in it is the name Jehovah written, if not hundreds, thousands of times repeated in different languages. And it just tells you the obsession that there is with this name. And so it gave me the idea, listening to this guy's talk, and remembering this gate before you entered into that Bible exhibit, this obsession with Jehovah gave me an idea to do a word analysis and to see if it might lead me into some kind of, I don't know, insight into the transition of the movement into from Bible students into Jehovah's Witnesses. When did that occur? Because even though a greater portion of the movement left, the original movement, as Schnell indicated, 75% of the original movement left, there was still a core of the original Bible students who remained loyal to Rutherford, to the society, such that it allowed the society to see. I went to the Watchtower today archives on JW Facts, Paul Grundy's website, and I downloaded every Watchtower that he had for each year, from 1879 to whatever year it is he stops. I forget where. I think his last Watchtower issues are sometime in the 1940s. I found another website that I could download the remainder of Watchtower archives from through the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s to the present time. And I went through each one and just did a search on the word Jehovah. And also I did a word search on God, and I just did a simple count on the number of times that the word Jehovah showed up in a given year of the Watchtower, and then divided that by the page, the number of pages for that year's issues of 12 issues of the magazine. And it's interesting that during Russell's era, there wasn't a fixed number of pages for the Watchtower. It could vary. Some years there could be 900 pages. Some years there were 400. So in the 20s, it became fixed at around 700 and some odd, 768 pages, and then there was a period where it was 300 some odd pages, and so it standardized a little bit, but it varies from period to period. But I got a density, so this is a ratio of the number of times, these little blue dots that you see here, the number of times the word Jehovah appears for a year, divided by the number of pages for that year. And that kind of normalizes the frequency. It's sort of a density. We can think of it as a Jehovah density. And the orange dots on this plot are a 6-day rolling average, and that gives you a little smoother trending. Gives you the average value through the points. And there is a little spread, as you can see. There's a little more spread during the early years, during Russell's era, than there was during the later years. And there also is some change in the frequency. You can see here the curve takes a jump. And so I was thinking, what was going on during these particular years that we see these behaviors, this change. And so from the earliest issue in 1879 to about 1905, and I put these blue vertical lines in to denote inflection changes, roughly speaking, where the curve actually is changing its slope. And you could see that during Russell's, a good portion of Russell's life, there was a decreasing trend of his use in the frequency of his use in the word Jehovah. And there was an initial variability. Oh, one other thing I want to point on this chart, because of the great changes we're talking about, from hundreds to tens of thousands in frequency of the word, I plotted the axis on what we call a log scale, 10, 100, 1,000, and so on, so that the data better fit and presented on the chart. But it yields the trends that I wanted to take a look at. So it's just a convenience that I plotted it on this log scale. And so the first change is that you see a decline in Russell's era in the frequency at which he uses the word Jehovah until a certain point. And around 1905, you begin to see a flattening and curving up during his lifetime to about 1915, 1916 in the frequency. And it's not only reflected in the 6-day average, which I centered on the year that was right in the middle of the averaging period. So it took in 3 years in advance of the point and 3 years behind the point. So this way it reflects there's no shift in time. When you do a rolling average, you have to compensate for whatever time shift that it may result in. So anyway, this data does take in data that hasn't occurred yet on the orange points, But that doesn't matter, because you could see that there was indeed a change in the frequency just by visually looking at the blue points, which are the actual data. So between the early 1900s, around 1903, to about 1915, 1916, Russell once again began to more frequently use the term Jehovah. And I began thinking, what might have caused that? And if you go into Macmillan's Faith on the March, there may be a clue there. Around page 59, Macmillan, A.H. Macmillan, Alexander Hugh Macmillan, who was one of Russell's favorite, favored followers. He, by the end of Russell's life, Macmillan, who was in his 30s, had become quite a prominent individual in the Bible students movement, and Russell called Macmillan into a meeting just before he left on his last trip before he died. And they had a 3-hour discussion on Russell's vision for the Watchtower. And I think Russell realized that this was his legacy, this organization. I mean, his personal life was a failure. He had a nasty divorce that followed him into around 1907, that forced him in part to move to Brooklyn, New York. That was one reason. Another reason for the move to Brooklyn, New York was that New York City was the gateway of the United States to the world. And it was the center of commerce for the United States, of business. That's where Wall Street was. And I think he had big ideas for the Watchtower Society. And in order for the society to grow, the thrust of their meeting was Russell's vision on the future, that there was a greater work in store for the Watchtower than just the focus that it had from 1874 up till that time, up until its move to New York, which mainly centered only around what he called the harvest age, the harvest, the gospel age harvest. That it was mostly, his work was mostly focused on the 144,000, those who would be running what he called for the prize of the high calling. And now I think he began to see the movement had potential. There was a great deal of growth from 1900 on. We're talking, a growth from hundreds to thousands, and thousands of classes or ecclesias, congregations, whatever you want to call them, around the United States, most of them small, a number of them fairly large. But he saw that this organization had a potential, and I think he wanted to grow it. He modeled the Watchtower after more of a corporate model rather than a church, and I think he expected it to become a worldwide phenomenon, and that he wasn't going to be able to live to see that growth because his health was in such a decline that he didn't expect to see it happen. But the discussion that he had with Macmillan centered on the continuance of that work, what that work would be, and who might be those that would be instrumental in carrying on the work as his successor. And according to Macmillan, Russell actually had hoped that Macmillan would actually take on the leadership role of the Watchtower, but Macmillan didn't feel like he was ready, and then that he didn't actually want that responsibility. He liked his position as it was, and he didn't want to take the flack. Once they had moved to Brooklyn, I didn't realize how unwelcome they were in Brooklyn until I got to see some of the Brooklyn Eagle articles, and we'll take a look at that in a little bit. Again, one thing led to another when I did this word analysis. So you can begin to see this curve, and I think Russell was becoming more autocratic. This is something that the Bible students will not accept, will not see. But there's a 1910 Watchtower article that advocates for studying exclusively from the studies in the scriptures and Russell's writings, and that those who study straight from the Bible, it's their experience that they would be out of the truth, quote unquote truth, within 2 years. And so Russell wanted his devotees to study only from his writings. That's the only source of truth, and so that is one of the hallmarks of a cult. And plus, separating themselves from the world. You are in the world, but not of it. And they had their own nomenclature, their own language, and in fact, there are circumstances where individuals. There was a news article about a 17-year-old girl who went to work at the Bethel, and her mother took issue with that, and there's an article, a Brooklyn Eagle article about this situation. In fact, a guy, William Hollister, who was a public relations person back then for Russell, was interviewed about this situation that suggested that this girl was taken, who was really a mother's dependent. She was only 17. Was taken and captured by the Watchtower away from her mother against her mother's will, and her mother was suing the Watchtower over it. That surprised me. I wasn't aware of that circumstance. We'll take a look at that one. I got a bunch of newspaper clippings that we can look at. And the reason I like newspaper clippings is because they're real. Again, whatever you read, you have to realize that you're reading it from a biased point of view. Like Faith on the March is Macmillan's point of view. The Watchtower's history is their point of view. The Bible students have their own point of view, and they've documented it. And I grew up with that side of the story. And then there's the Brooklyn Eagle that printed stories. They were not very favorable of Russell. And in fact, Russell didn't like them very well and sued them for $100,000, which was a hell of a lot of money back in 1907 or whatever it was he sued them. We'll look at that in a bit. But it just makes you wonder, as the movement began to grow and Russell saw the potential for it to grow, I think he also realized that there was, in order to be able to do what he envisioned it to do, you needed an autocratic style of control. Another indication besides studying only from Russell's writings was something that was found in the Proclaimer's book. And I found this, some 10 years ago in a Baker's book, and it kind of surprised me. Anybody who wanted to be a speaker or a pilgrim speaker associated with the Watchtower and representative of the Watchtower, you had to pass a test. And this test was a subjective test. It was an essay test, and here's a copy of it here. This was issued in 1916, and you had to pass with a score of 85% in order to be a representative of the Watchtower. And this happened during Russell's era, 1916. Nothing happened without Russell's approval. Now this test came out likely before Russell passed. Russell died on October 31st, 1916. So there were only 2 months after that, and they were so traumatized by the death of Russell. The movement, the Bible students movement, was so traumatized by Russell's death that nothing really much happened afterwards except some confusion about what to do and where to go and how to do it. And there wasn't time to think about putting together a test. You would think that something like this would be low on their priorities. So this occurred during Russell's lifetime. This occurred with his approval. Nothing was issued, nothing was done with Watchtower without Russell's approval. He had absolute control of the society. And so this is another indication of an increasing autocracy. Another indicator is that sometime after the trial, the divorce trial in 1903, Russell came up with what they called the vow, and that became very controversial. And the vow was about sexual propriety, as well as vowing to remain free from the occult. He had two things in mind with the vow: the occult and sexual propriety. And with the sexual propriety, you take a vow that it's a very cumbersome worded thing, but it actually, there's something very similar in place for Bethelites today, where the door has to stay open if you're in the room of somebody of the opposite sex who isn't closely related to you, and it goes on, and there are these exceptions, except in the case of a mother, brother, sister, blah blah, natural brother, natural sister. They distinguish between fleshly sisters and brothers and spiritual sisters and brothers. It was becoming more and more of an autocratic cult centered around Russell in those years, following their move to Brooklyn. Actually, really since 1900, when things began. We can see that toward the end of Russell's life, we see an increase in the term Jehovah. And it's interesting that you had these things that occurred, and evidence of an increasing autocratic control of the Watchtower, or tendency in the Watchtower, at a period of its early exponential growth. It's very obvious that during the 1920s, under the new headship under Joseph Rutherford, starting at around 1920, because that's about when things really began to heat up with the movement again. Everybody is familiar with the fact that the entire board of directors and officers got thrown into jail for sedition for about 9 months. That kind of held up work for the Watchtower for about a year. But when they came out, Rutherford came out with guns blazing. There was a series of conventions that were held in 1919 through 1922 at Cedar Point, Ohio, where the emphasis was to reinvigorate the movement, to advertise, to grow. And that was the focus, to grow the movement. Again, doctrinally, they hadn't changed much. They basically had the preponderance of their beliefs through the 20s was still pretty much what Russell taught. They didn't have Jonadabs. They didn't have the great multitude by which they could swell ranks for the Watchtower, but they were laying the foundation for that by increasing the activity of the existing membership to grow. And you could see there during that time there was a jump to the frequency in which the word Jehovah was used up until about 1931. And I put that blue line there, marking that inflection point, let's put it that way, because it curves over, it flattens, and it's like a big step over that decade between 1915 and 1930. There is a big step increase in the frequency in the word Jehovah. One of the things that Rutherford was noted for was taking autocratic control over the organization, and that was actually the complaint that caused the 1919 split. PSL Johnson left. He felt that he should be the one overseeing the work of the Watchtower. While the directors and others that formed the PBI felt that the president shouldn't have as strong a control. But Rutherford, Macmillan, and Van Amberg, they worked very closely with Russell. Van Amberg, since 1903, Rutherford was the legal counsel, worked closely with Russell since 1907, and Macmillan was the manager of the Bethel family and the work the work that went on with the sort of the office, overseeing the office staff, and they knew Russell's vision, and I believe they understood how he wanted it done. I think Russell himself would have done something very similar to what Rutherford did, except he wouldn't have taken the, let's say, the hard approach or sort of bully approach that Rutherford is known for. Russell was more subtle. I don't think he was any better a person, and we can look at some of these things that give that insight, but I think Russell was more of a subtle, and in that sense I think he was more deceitful than Rutherford. Rutherford, at least what you saw is what you got, so there was no pretense on his part as to what was going to be and what wasn't going to be. I don't think that's necessarily better, but at least you knew the devil you knew, I mean, is the saying. So Rutherford really made a difference. The movement elected Rutherford. It's interesting to see the structure of the Watchtower at the time Russell died. If Russell wanted things to go a certain way, he would have done so. He knew what kind of a person Rutherford was. He knew Macmillan. He knew the people around him. And if he didn't want any one of them he would have made it absolutely such that they would have no chance of taking any part in the work. He had done that already. He had done that with people that were close to him, that had worked very closely with him in the past. Ernest Hennings worked with him very closely before the turn of the century, and some years afterwards. And Hennings was married to Rose Ball, the infamous Rose Ball, and I'm not going to get into that so much, except that caused a great deal of problem for him publicity-wise, because his marriage was down the tubes, so to speak, and Rose Ball was a good part of the decline in his marriage. She took center stage. Well, Russell married Ernest Hennings to Rose in the late 1890s and sent them to Australia. And that was about the time his wife finally left him. Mariah, as I've been informed is how she pronounced it, Mariah Russell, left him, which was in 1897. We'll get into some early stuff about Russell's life, kind of revealing what kind of a person he was a little bit later. It's sort of the sequence of how things went with my investigation here into Russell, because I've always grown up with the idea that Russell was this wonderful thing, and that Rutherford seized control, usurped control over the society, and took it off in the devil's direction. And I don't necessarily think that's the case. But let's continue looking at this chart a little bit more. I've got something wrong here. I have the date. Jehovah's Witnesses formed in 1932. That's wrong. It was the Dawn that was formed in 1932. Jehovah's Witnesses came to be in, I think it was Toledo, Ohio Convention in 1931. There was a resolution that was passed that from that point forth, those associated with Watchtower would be known as Jehovah's Witnesses, and that was in 1931. So I have that date wrong. Please forgive that. But it's in that same part of the curve, early 1930s, and you could see there that once this transition had taken place, there was a decline again in the frequency in the use of the name Jehovah in the printed word. Again, this is a normalized curve. This is a density, a word density. So it's looking at the frequency at which the word Jehovah is used per page, or in this case per 1,000 pages, because like with the death rate, it's how many deaths per 100,000 people, because instead of dealing with low decimal numbers, you multiply it by a factor so that you can have a more discernible or understandable or conceptual number. But you can see that from the mid-1930s to 1980, forgive the wind, I am sorry about the sound quality of this, but I wanted to do this outdoors. It's so beautiful out, but it's very breezy. I apologize for that. To 1980, there was a very definitive decline in the frequency, similar to the decline that Russell, you could see. They're maybe not quite as steep, but there's a definite decline there in that period, that 50-year period or 45-year period. And the structure of the Watchtower, it achieved a status quo. All of the control was in the president of the Watchtower Society, and the rating and the control of the entire movement was in the hands of one or two individuals. Rutherford died in very early 1942, January 8th, I believe it was, and Nathan Knorr took his place. It was almost a triumvirate. Fred Franz took on a very prominent role. He was the vice president. Covington, the lawyer, was for a while, but he didn't feel as one of the Jonadabs that he was qualified to be a leader for the Watchtower. And so Fred Franz became the vice president, and Nathan Knorr and Fred Franz really controlled the Jehovah's Witness movement for that entire period. And during that period, there was an exponential growth in the number of individuals associated with Watchtower. And in his book, 1959 book, Faith on the March, Macmillan noted that what was occurring, what had happened up to that point in the Jehovah's Witnesses, in the Watchtower Society, was a fulfillment of what Russell had in mind for his vision of the Watchtower. And though there's a bias, again, the winners write the history, but you can't necessarily say that everything that was said was false. So you do have to recognize that there is truth in somebody's perspective. And I don't see any reason to believe that what Macmillan said about having achieved Russell's vision was necessarily wrong. I believe that Russell did indeed believe that the Watchtower had a great work that it had to be done, and that it took a strong hand in order to accomplish it. Russell did use the word theocracy. I believe I looked into this years ago, and theocracy was not an unusual idea. I mean, the whole idea of the kingdom is that God rules as a king. Jesus rules as a king. He's God's king for the kingdom, and that's an absolute authoritarian type of control. And that was what Russell envisioned as an ideal society, that there would be this beneficial autocracy that would bless all the families of the world, and that those that didn't want to cooperate with this autocratic control would be put to death forever in the second death. So Russell was of the mind, and that of a strong leadership. And I think the idea of independent ecclesias was a convenience because it would require more administrative aspects, more administrative requirements and demands on Russell than if each of the ecclesias were controlled on their own, and I don't think he wanted that. He was still developing his he was spreading his name, he was getting publicity, he was getting the Watchtower notice, and he was developing a doctrine and a following. And I think he realized that at some certain point in time, the organization was going to be too big for it to operate that way and to continue operating that way, and that it would need a stronger hand. And I think that's reflected by this tick upwards during his lifetime in the frequency of the word Jehovah. We see that during periods of increasing autocracy, the use of the word Jehovah increases. So let's look at this curve. I pointed out that there were declines between 1879 and just about 1903, 1904, and then a steep, sudden, almost step jump to through the 20s to the early 30s. But once the Watchtower had pretty well established its new structure, there was a decline in the frequency in the use of the word Jehovah until 1975, and you can see here that there was a gradual change in the slope. And 1975 is infamous among Jehovah's Witnesses for the last failed prophecy for the date, at least from a date perspective. During the 1960s, in the middle 1960s, the Watchtower began encouraging the idea and endorsing the idea that the 6,000 years of sin would end in 1975, and that Job's kingdom, Armageddon, would come in 1975, and the kingdom would be established after that. And so there was this expectation that really impacted the society when that prediction failed. There was a coup in the leadership. There was a body called the governing body that had just been formed in the early 1970s that was independent of the management, the corporate management of Watchtower. And this organization, the governing body, began to assert itself in control over the body of Jehovah's Witnesses to some extent in the early 70s. But after 1975 and the failure of the prediction, that was the coup de grace for Watchtower's corporate leadership. And Noor died in 1976, and that was when the governing body asserted its full control over the whole operation. And what do you see here? Beginning in 1980, you see a beginning in the increase in the frequency of the use of Jehovah. And we'll look at that a little bit more closely in a second. But you notice that blue line there that I have around 1980. Ray Franz was a phenomena within the governing body. He represented a dissenting voice to some extent. That dissent was permitted within the society, and it was closely associated with a failed prophecy. There was some questioning as to, well, if they could be wrong about 1975, what else are they wrong about? And Ray Franz had some ideas of his own about the society and some of its teachings that landed him on the wrong end of things, and he was forced to resign by extreme pressure by the governing body. And in fact, he was forced out of the Watchtower and Jehovah's Witnesses altogether, ultimately disfellowshipped. And I think that marked a change. From that point on, the governing body has taken on absolute control over the organization. And I don't think that there will be any other organizational changes, but you never know. But there doesn't appear to be anything. It seems that the governing body is well established. But over the years, especially since the around the year 2000, the internet has come into existence and has created something that, in terms of information dissemination, that we've never seen before. And now Watchtower is facing a real dilemma among what they call apostate attacks. There's more information more freely available about the organization that's just a click on a computer away. And so this has resulted in a decline in the growth rate in the numbers. The external growth from witnessing work has declined to almost nothing. The growth that takes place within the Watchtower, within the ranks of the Jehovah's Witnesses, is largely from those that were born into the society. And it's growing not at a 5 or 10% rate, but at a rate of about 1%, 1 to 1.5% a year, which reflects basically the population growth of the world. So it's really growth just from those that are born in and remain in. But Pew Research on religions did identify Jehovah's Witnesses as having the greatest turnover in membership of any religion. So with that, we've taken a look at this chart and how the Watchtower has responded in its frequency in the use of the word Jehovah when it's facing circumstances of instability and where it has to assert itself, the leadership has to assert itself in greater control. They also, it results in a corresponding increase in the use of the term Jehovah. It's kind of an interesting phenomenon in this word study, and you can see that that's happening in the later years, and that's as a result of the more desperate attempts of the Watchtower to thwart the exodus from its membership. There is a huge exodus over the last 2 or 3 decades from Watchtower as a result of largely as a result of the internet. So with that, let's take a look at some other interesting things. And you know what I might do? I might just break this up into 2 different videos. So we'll stop at this point, and we'll pick up in a part 2.